I'm gonna say this on the record. Okay, we're recording now. So I was saying that I'm also very happy because I can now sit in this corner of the house and you cannot hear the dogs. Can you hear them? You cannot hear them.
No.
And that's because I found the secret sauce is to put the shitty, disgusting pate thing on their bone that they love to chew on. And they are busy for like hours now.
Hours?
Like a good 2 hours. Like I have a life now.
Wow.
I don't know what to do with it.
We used to do that for not our like my cousins have a dog, which is like the family dog because it's the only dog in the family. But it didn't work. Like she'd be like 15 minutes and she'd be like, and then done.
One day we will probably not because it's not relevant, but I can talk to you a lot about dog stuff because I've had to do dog training and behaviorist stuff because one of our dogs is problematic.
I've been following dog behavior Instagram accounts. I don't have a dog, but I want to get one, and I'm learning so much.
It's fascinating.
It's fascinating. Yeah, they're like, oh, this dog looks like it wants pets, but does it? You know.
Okay,
and then it gives you the little clues, like the.
So welcome to the Fire These Times.
God, every time. Okay.
Okay, let's do this. Okay, so hi everyone, welcome to the Fire These Times. Today we are doing a episode on Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan's usage of Karabakh after the ethnic cleansing and genocide at COP28. So we're gonna give some brief context of what all of this means and why is it a big deal and why is it super problematic, to put it very, very, very mildly, especially as has it been confirmed that they are doing COP next year in Azerbaijan, or do they just want to do it and they haven't? But like, it's gonna happen.
It has been. It's been shot. They've been selected.
Okay, so what does this mean? Why is it a big deal? Why is it really problematic? This is what we're going to do in this episode, and we're doing so with Karena, Avedissian, and Anna, co-hosts of Obscuristan, the podcast that is also joining the wider network. We'll probably talk about this as well. And yeah, that's roughly what we're going to be talking about. And I will mention Aliyev's mustache because I figured I should just do it once, just for the sake of it. That I don't
think
like
it's his debut on the Fire These Times. So yes, tell us your opinions on Aliyev's mustache, Joey.
It's stupid. It's really ugly. That's it. I did not have an elaborate opinion. That's it.
Yours is better. I think we can agree. Yours is better. So is mine.
Thank you. All right. So do we do just quick intros for folks who may not know of you, but will know of you very soon more and more? Let's start with Anna, just doing it. And also because the name of the novel is Anna Karena. So I don't know. We have to.
Every time. This was ordained pre-birth. Yes. Hi, my name is Anna. I am a co-host of Obscuristan with Karena. We will be returning hopefully very soon, and we'll be joining the larger The Fire These Times network with Joey, which we're really excited about because, as you're about to learn in this episode, there is just a shocking amount of connections between the struggles that many different people face, and we really want to address them. So we're excited.
Hi, everybody. I'm Karena, and I live in Armenia. I have a former academic background. I'm currently working as an analyst in Yerevan. And yeah, as Anna said, I'm a co-host of Obscuristan, and we're super excited to be joining the larger The Fire These Times family very soon.
We discovered recently, there was a photo sent on one of the signal groups that Karena and I are in. Oh, I think Karena, you don't understand that, so that makes sense.
We can talk about it though.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. So it's describe it. Go for it.
So it's a surreptitiously taken photo of a screen at what I assume is like the Azerbaijan stand.
Pavilion at COP, yeah.
Pavilion, yeah. And it's a screen, and on the bottom left corner it says, Karabakh is the first region in Azerbaijan to achieve net zero. And that's where this all began.
Karena, do you want to tell us
you
what
have
COP
thoughts?
is?
People don't know what COP is.
I didn't.
Listeners, do some fucking. No, I'm joking. Okay, so the UN framework of a convention on climate change is what it's called. Is COP for short, the Conference of Parties. It's the yearly climate conference, basically the biggest one, clearly the most consequential one. The big Paris one of some years ago is when they even agreed on the basic problem. And this time around, actually, they seem to have at least agreed that maybe fossil fuel isn't amazing and it needs to be phased out, although there's no actual timeline for that. So anyway, lots of problems on COP. I did an episode on COP with two scientists some months ago that are involved in the IPCC. And I've had Julia Steinberger on a few times. She's one of the authors of the IPCC document, if folks want to check those out as well for more like in-depth stuff. But that's COP.
And since Azerbaijan has been selected to host this conference next year, and since the really fun photo leak that Joey and Karena just described, we're going to be talking about Azerbaijan's ties to, I don't even know what to call it, eco-fascism, I guess.
Greenwashing.
Greenwashing is the correct term. But we're going to take it back.
There's going to be an eco-fascism dimension to this, I'm sure, in one way or another. I haven't fully explored that personally yet.
Yeah, I think it's more faux eco-fascism, if I'm being honest. But I want to take it back 1 year to like, this is not the origin of Azerbaijan's eco-fascism, but it is like one of the more like amazing, or sorry, greenwashing. But it is one of the more like amazing examples of it. Okay, so about almost exactly 1 year ago now, on December 12th, Azerbaijani eco-activists blocked the Lachin corridor, which was at the time the only road connecting Armenia to the Republic of Artsakh, or Nagorno-Karabakh. They cited mining projects in Nagorno-Karabakh as the reason for blocking this road, saying that the ecology of the Republic of Artsakh, or I think they would say Nagorno-Karabakh, was being destroyed, and that their rights were being violated. Somehow, this little group of eco-activists managed to block the entire Lachin corridor so effectively that nobody could get in and out of Artsakh for the next year. They, of course, were not working alone. It was, of course, a government-backed, government-supported protest. But there was like this really bizarre, was it like a month? There was this bizarre month where Armenians had to tell people that these weren't actually eco-activists. And I think, for me personally, that was the most bizarre, like, several weeks of my life, of having to genuinely engage with the idea that there was a small protest group in Azerbaijan, a country where protests are routinely shut down and like don't even spring up because they're going to be shut down so quickly, but that there was like a little ragtag group of eco-activists who were just so concerned about the mines in Nagorno-Karabakh that they had managed to shut down travel in and out of the country completely. This, of course, is not the case. It was a front by the Azerbaijani government, which they quickly gave up on. But nonetheless, it did not stop like media from reporting on it, and it didn't stop like a conversation in the earnest about happening like internationally about this. This, of course, led to the months-long blockade of the Republic of Artsakh, which led to food shortages, water shortages, electricity shortages, gas shortages, medicine shortages, and eventually the ethnic cleansing and the genocide of all 120. Well, I don't want to say. It was
over 100,000 is the.
That was I meant that the ethnic cleansing of 120,000, the entire 120,000 person population of the Republic of Artsakh. I would characterize this as genocide, despite the fact that all 120,000 people did not die. I didn't mean to imply that. But yeah, there are no more Armenians left in Nagorno-Karabakh. They are all refugees now. And their status, though dire, is not the topic of this podcast. You can listen to some of our other appearances on the Fire These Times to learn about that. So yeah, that little vignette can ground you in Azerbaijan's ecological lofty aspirations.
And just to quickly add on that, to contrast that with actual grassroots environmental activism in Azerbaijan. So like just 6 months after the blockade of Artsakh began, it was in June of 2023 of this year. where there was a demonstration, mostly consisting of older women. And it was kind of put down by the police. There were videos of this like gratuitous violence, and they were spraying kind of like pepper spray in their faces. And this is just to kind of compare and contrast like an actual authentic, environmental protest in Azerbaijan, which is not sanctioned by the state. So it's just, another kind of, I guess, foundation to the understanding that the eco-activists that blockaded or initiated the blockade before the soldiers actually kind of formalized it with an actual checkpoint was not, an authentic. I can't believe I'm saying this. It's just obvious, but because
I was thinking the exact same
Azerbaijan is
thing.
saying it. Yeah.
I think that's a perfect segue, because that is actually, I think, the encapsulation of Azerbaijan's entire like ecological policy, I think, because there's this veneer that we have to engage with for some god-awful fucking reason, even though it's just patently bizarre. I mean, the protest, or like, and I want to use air quotes, but you can't see them, but the quote unquote protest that started the blockade was such a level of like absurdistan comedy. Like, you could have filmed it and put it on Borat. Like, there was one, and this is not intellectually informative for any of you, but it is hysterical. There was like a scene where a woman was like speaking impassionately about peace and tried to release a dove into the air, and the dove, like, this poor creature was like being flung in, like, she was kind of rattling it left and right, and then she flung this like bird into the air, which promptly flopped. Like, it was thrown into the air and then just died. And it was so, I mean,
it was
she was
dead. Squeezing
like,
it.
it's so awful, but so absurd and stupid. Like, it just was like the most ridiculous sights were coming out of this protest. And for some reason, we still had to like engage with the idea of that, like, there were eco-activists blocking the road. But that is also true of Azerbaijan's policy when it comes to like green energy. So one of the underlying, Azerbaijan has long sort of had these bizarre like aspirations for net zero in Karabakh. I remember them talking about it even in 2020 during the war and the Artsakh war, where they talked about like green energy for Shushi and building. There were like some rumblings and tweets about building like net zero housing in Shushi and things like that. And it's really like dark and terrible, like scary to be talking about, building like the amazing green housing that you're going to build in an area that you're planning on ethnically cleansing. But then it actually came to be. And so one of the things I wanted to address was that analysts actually indicated that conflict over water was one of the things that was driving Azerbaijan's desire for like the war in 2020, and even like as far back as 2016, and even further back, there was dispute over water and dams in Nagorno-Karabakh. So basically, Azerbaijan has a lot of trouble getting water into its country because it's 75% of the water in Azerbaijan comes from outside of Azerbaijan, and the rivers and the water in Karabakh is perfect for damming because of the mountainous area, and there was a long dispute over the dams in this area. Without going too much into the details, Azerbaijan wants to start damming that water and wants to start redirecting that water into Azerbaijan, not necessarily so they can like achieve net neutrality as a country, but because they want to start exporting their natural gas. So as we talked, I think in some previous episodes, that Azerbaijan is positioning itself as like a natural gas partner to Europe, and has started to export more of natural gas. It's also starting to refine Russian oil, which is even more incredible because that means that Europe is still going to be importing Russian oil. It's just going to be refined in Azerbaijan now instead of in Russia. So they're the perfect middleman. They're exporting their own natural gas. They're exporting Russian natural gas and Russian oil. And in order to meet the energy needs of their own people, they're going to start damming water and using hydropower within Azerbaijan. And so you see that like this doesn't actually like help Azerbaijan's use of alternative energy sources. It allows them to continue and increase and ramp up their production of fossil fuels to export into Europe. And in order to supplement that, they need something else. And because they don't have enough water traveling into Azerbaijan, and because like water agreements between the countries in the region haven't been modified, I think, since the Soviet Union, they like are able to greenwash their behavior or greenwash genocide in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Okay, so there's so much there. Couple of points. The damming aspect of it is something I would like to explore one day, because it's a fascinating thing that most governments had in common at one point. The Americans kind of pioneered it in many ways, and then it was sort of exported as a tactic. It was sort of started becoming discredited in the 80s, but a lot of governments that there is probably a tendency between an authoritarian, it's like there's a correlation, between being authoritarian and therefore not accepting feedback from, or being less likely to accept feedback from scientists or eco-activists or whatever, and being less authoritarian and maybe being more amenable to that. Because in Lebanon, we had a very similar problems of dammings, which I won't get into too much. I wrote a few pieces on that if people want to look those up, on the Bisri Valley, Bisri. And the reason why the government wanted to dam it, that valley, basically, was just because there was a program from the 50s and they just didn't give up on it. There was no eco reason for that. There was no energy even need for that at one point, or the cost was going to be too high. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you mentioned whitewashing genocide, and we're already seeing this is something we kind of found out, especially before recording. I will put all of this in the show notes. Azerbaijan, in that same pavilion, or during that same time at COP in Dubai, this is the headline: Azerbaijan presents green energy potential of Karabakh and Eastern Zangezur at COP28 in Dubai. And this is an Azerbaijani website, if that's not obvious. How did we find out? What is kind of problematic about even the framing, besides the obvious greenwashing, which is that it's not green energy potential and it's bullshit, and we're talking about a petro-dictatorship that obviously wants to do everything to distract away from the fact that it's a petro-dictatorship. But okay, we know about Karabakh, we know why that's, and we'll get into it more. But what about the term Eastern Zangezur? Why is that also problematic for folks who don't know? Because I didn't know before this.
So Zangezur is the sort of Azerbaijani Turkish word for the southern Armenian province of Syunik. And if you look at the map of Armenia in the southern part, it's like a strip of land that goes all the way down to Iran. So on the west is Nakhichevan, Azerbaijan's exclave. To the south is Iran, and then to the west is Azerbaijan. And to the west is where, Artsakh was, and to call that region Eastern Zangezur, which is a new term. It's like literally just before pressing record, Anna and I had to look it up because we'd never heard of this.
Well, it was officially established on the 7th of July, 2021, according to Wiki.
Yeah. And it hasn't really been deployed that much until now. So it has this sort of irredentist foundation because, as scholar Lawrence Browers has written, when you have an Eastern Zangezur, it's implied that there's a Western Zangezur, which is the Armenian province of Syunik. So it's laying claim to sovereign Armenian territory after, Azerbaijan's main argument against Armenia and the international community being, it's violating our territorial integrity.
I also want to note that the exclave that Karena mentioned, Nakhichevan, was also ethnically cleansed of its Armenian population.
I wanted to talk a bit about the geopolitical aspect of this greenwashing that Azerbaijan is doing. First of all, the screenshot that we were just discussing, the net zero. I just, in case it's not obvious for your listeners, maybe it is. That's because there's no human activity right now. It's because it's been ethnically cleansed and genocided of its Armenians. There's no jobs, there's no industry, there's nothing happening there. That's why. And it's not, this isn't greenwashing, I would say, in the classic sense. Like an example of a classic greenwashing campaign would be, for example, BP, which rebranded itself into Beyond Petroleum to kind of be able to say things like, we're really into renewable energy and all that stuff. But Azerbaijan isn't even that desperate to convince us of its green credentials. It's rather, I think, this kind of creative PR because it knows it's done something really bad. So it does this sort of conjuring trick, don't look at the fact that our genocidal policies and 3 years of atrocities against Armenians forcibly expel them in their entirety. actually instead look at this nice net zero status over here. And it's interesting also because, is it new? Is this kind of greenwashing thing? No, it's not. As Anna mentioned, it started with the beginning of the blockade and probably before there's other examples. But in terms of like PR for Azerbaijan, it's not new. And Azerbaijan has been engaging in this kind of targeted PR campaigns to improve its image internationally. Greenwashing is one. Another one, perhaps its most notable one, it's kind of like this PR pillar of it, which is Azerbaijan as this quote unquote multicultural state. And what's funny is in preparation for this episode, I tried to access Azerbaijan's website on multiculturalism, and it's blocked for me because I'm in Armenia. So I can't, read about how multicultural it is. So greenwashing isn't this sort of shiny new thing for the country. It has to be seen within this context of this like multi-pronged PR campaign to rescue the image of the country. Because, at its heart, it's an authoritarian petro state where the president took over from his father and made his wife vice president, and that it ethnically cleansed Armenians of Artsakh, genocided them. And in the aftermath of that genocide, it has intensified its repression against its own domestic dissidents to the point where just recently, I think they've essentially arrested all of their independent journalists now. And about that multiculturalism in Azerbaijan as this PR campaign, it's, true that different linguistic and religious communities coexist peacefully in Azerbaijan in this like kind of secular context. But, let's also keep in mind that Azerbaijan's post-independence narrative is largely based on hatred of Armenians, and the fact that other ethnic minorities in Azerbaijan have been arrested and imprisoned repeatedly. So, when it says it's multicultural, it's literally just referring to the fact of its cultural diversity, not that it has actual multicultural kind of policies or that it enacts multiculturalism. So I think we need to see this greenwashing campaign kind of within this broader context of kind of, whitewashing its image after, it does incredibly abhorrent things and constantly gets away with them in the international community. It hasn't, paid any price for the genocide of Artsakh Armenians. And this is something that through a contacts, I know for a fact, Azerbaijani officials inside Azerbaijan have said that they're shocked that they kind of got away with it.
Yeah, I also I want to not only address the fact that like Azerbaijan got away with the like total ethnic cleansing of its Armenian population as a like blueprint for, I think I don't want to say a blueprint for Israel's policies in Gaza, because I understand that Israel's policy, I don't actually know who learns from who anymore between Azerbaijan and Israel, because they're very linked,
but learn from one another.
Yeah, but to Karina's point about like Azerbaijan's reliance on its multiculturalism, it uses its relationship to Israel as a substitute for like its relationship to its own Jewish population, which there's a lot to be said about Azerbaijan's relationship to its Jewish population, much of which is very likely positive, much of which is positive. But Azerbaijan relies a lot on its relationship with Israel to sort of bolster this like multicultural, religious status. And something that like also is important and interesting is that in its development of its like new energy policies, of its quote unquote green energy policies, Azerbaijan is actually relying on Israel and Turkey. And so Mekarat, Israel's national water company, signed a first of its kind work agreement in Azerbaijan last week. I say last weekend I'm reading, but in like April of 2022, because Azerbaijan wants to rework its entire water management system. And so they signed an agreement with the Israeli National Water Management Company to rework their entire water management system. In part, this was after the Artsakh War. So it was after they regained control of key dams and waterways. And so immediately they signed an agreement with an Israeli company to start developing those. And Israel is not the only one. Turkish companies have also started, quote, developing these like water projects. And something interesting to note there as well is that Turkey has used water as a way to control its own like dissident and like ethnic rights movement. Sorry, that was a terrible way to describe the Kurdish movement for liberation, but that's what I'm talking about. Turkey used the Southeast Anatolia project to like and its effect on downstream rivers to leave Syria and Iraq in severe drought, which increased Turkey's ability to control or like have influence in these areas and in these countries, which severely weakened Kurdish national movements, because now like the lands in which they're relying, they rely on Turkish national control of water to be able to survive. And so this is like a very well worked out blueprint, and it didn't get a lot of coverage in it didn't get a lot of coverage in like any media. I don't even want to say international media, but there were some great articles written in EurasiaNet by Nada Kuyumcan, which I've like been relying heavily on. There was a great VOA report which was published in 2021, which talks about like the water drop in the Euphrates River, increasing tension between Syrian Kurds and Turkey. And there was some OC media reporting on it. So like some excellent reporting has been done on this, but it was never really like, this was never considered a conflict over water, which I do think would be like a mischaracterization of it. But I think that the fact that Azerbaijan like immediately saw the physical resources in Karabakh that they could develop, that they could exploit, that they could control without the Armenian people is significant. And it reminds me a lot of like the sort of the videos that you see coming out of Israel with people talking about like, what would you want in Gaza? If there were no people there, what would you build in Gaza? And I remember very clearly in 2020, there isn't the same kind of like media access to Azerbaijan as there is to Israel. So you're not going to get the same like interviewing extremist people in the streets sort of like content. But there were, I mentioned this earlier, but there were tweets of like people talking about the like housing that was going to be built in Karabakh after the war, about like the beautiful like eco resorts that were going to be built in Karabakh after the war. And that kind of like imagining for a land that not only isn't yours, but like you need to ethnically cleanse in order to have control over, is really it's perverse, especially when you consider the status of Azerbaijan itself as like a petro-dictatorship, as Karena mentioned it. But it's also perverse on its own, because like land does not exist outside of its people, and land like has never existed outside of the people who have lived on it. And I think Armenians have done, there's less narratives about Armenians as like indigenous in relation to land, in part, I think, because like we lived through the Soviet Union, which was a heavily industrialized society, and the like connection to land was sort of stripped away from people in a sense. And Gana looks like she wants to say something, so I want her to interrupt me.
And also something that I've thought about a lot is that narratives and stories from the genocide seem to focus on the middle and wealthy classes in cities, which plays into this idea of like, well, they're not really, from anywhere. They're just this kind of, bourgeois people with nice clothes, and they, go to the studios and they take their nice photographs. Whereas like the majority of Armenians who were impacted by genocide, either murdered, killed, exiled, or whatever, were peasants. My father's side of the family, we don't have any photographs. They didn't, they couldn't take anything with them. There's no artifacts as such. So I think the narrative around Armenians and connection to land has also been affected by that.
I agree. And I think that there's just less narrative about it for that reason as well when it comes to the genocide. And then the industrialization of the Soviet Union was like deliberately intended to or deliberately designed to like make people less agrarian, make them less like emotionally connected to the land, which I think has really impacted Armenians' ability to talk about land in a way that sounds familiar to like indigenous struggle. But there's a really great Instagram account called Learn for Artsakh. And they've done some really incredible, I don't want to call it archival work, but just like resource distribution, and translation of important pieces. And I mean, there's also there's like a lot of information coming out of like Karabakh in like in the Soviet Union as my parents knew it was also limited because so much of it is in Russian. So like there's just so much translation and like there's so much information management that has to happen for even Armenians to access this information. But so my family grew up like really emotionally attached to mulberry trees. There's like lots of Armenian poems of mulberry trees. There's lots of there's like comedic movies about like families fighting over mulberry trees. Like you usually know the trees that grow on your property, like if you have a walnut tree or a mulberry tree. But I didn't know this. But apparently, like Leonid Gurunts, who was writing contemporaneously, he said, for centuries, the Armenians of Artsakh have planted mulberry trees in their gardens. Mulberry berries are dried, pekmez is boiled from them, medicinal syrup, and vodka is driven. 45 bulldozers in one day rushed into centuries-old trees, destroying almost 80% of the gardens. Why was this done? Isn't it clear? To undermine the forms of the peasants and force them to leave their homes, a kind of genocide forcing the Armenians to leave. So there is this history of like ecological destruction and a continued divorcing of Armenians from their connection to like land. And I don't want to overstate it, but I also want to be really clear that like Armenians are connected intrinsically to the land that they come from. They have like, there's a reason every Armenian iconography, poetry, music, songs are always about mountains. But as like to me, it seems like we're sort of left with that as our only connection, when in reality, the Armenians of Artsakh have lived in harmony with this land for centuries and for like even thousands of years. And that the interruption of various empires shouldn't change that is true. So yeah, there's layers and layers of this type of greenwashing, and there's layers and layers to the way that Azerbaijan has portrayed its ecological development of Karabakh that are all rooted in genocide.
I think that's just the kind of the elephant in the room, at least in my mind, was that how similar these are to Israeli tactics. What you were saying about mulberry trees reminds me a lot of, I mean, you can basically say the same.
Olive trees
in Palestine, and the obsession on behalf of like the obsession that we see with a lot of Israeli settlers in the West Bank with burning and destroying olive trees, like as a almost a compulsive thing to do. And that's always struck me as quite fascinating and obviously dark, because most of these olive trees, or a lot of them in any case, would be older than, like they go back to like Ottoman periods, the Ottoman times. The other thing is that the entire thing of greening the desert was part of, like Ben Gurion mentioned, that it was always part of the initial mythos in some sense of the Zionist movement, and obviously linked to the indigenous struggles, as you mentioned elsewhere. It's it's manifest destiny just repackaged. It's interesting how these things, the parallels basically, how like it's almost the exact same playbook, just the actors are different, the vocabulary is slightly different, the languages are different, but in terms of how to colonialism, or how to settler, or how to just exploit or whatever, it took me a bit by surprise how you mentioned it. I'm not surprised, but I'm kind of reflecting on that. It's interesting. It's a thing. It's definitely a thing now. I think I can say for certain that it's a phenomenon in colonial spaces, I guess, or colonized spaces.
I'm just adding an extra point to that. I had the privilege of visiting the home of the grandfather of a man who is a crypto-Armenian who lives in Van in Eastern Turkey. And
he took me to term, Karena, for those who don't know.
So crypto-Armenians are Armenians who survived the genocide and remained. And in most cases, they adopted Islam as their religion, changed their names, became kind of, Turkish or Kurdish outwardly, but who maintain certain traditions within the home, sometimes, certain words or like things like putting crosses into the lavash bread before they bake them, often generations down, not even knowing why they do that anymore, because they don't know who they are. In many cases, they don't know that they're Armenian. And some cases they do. Some cases they have forgotten, and then, someone discovered, the grandmother on her deathbed kind of mentions it, saying, actually, I'm Armenian. So there's lots of these stories. So this man is an Armenian, fully 100% Armenian. He's from my grandmother's village near Van. And he took me to his grandfather's house. And we were standing outside the gate, and I didn't quite understand what we were doing, where we were. I didn't understand the context. I was just kind of standing outside, and he started pointing out all the trees, saying, my grandfather planted this cherry tree and an apricot tree. And I heard voices coming from inside, and I was like, wait a minute, what? And this guy didn't speak English, by the way. We were communicating through Google Translate. And he says, oh, I started putting my camera or my phone over the gate to kind of take photos of the garden. And he was like, kind of got uncomfortable and was like, other people live there now. And I was like, what do you mean? And he said, well, one of the kind of leaders of the massacres in Van was rewarded with my grandfather's house. So these are the descendants living in the house. And that kind of goes to the parallels of like the settlers in Palestine, kind of, there's that famous photo, right, of the Palestinian woman, and I think her husband standing outside the door, kind of speaking to the people who live there now. Yeah.
If it's the same video I'm thinking of, the people who were living there were from Brooklyn.
Yeah, that's the one. I've just seen the image. I haven't seen the video. Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, Anna?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, God, in that I hadn't thought about how the genocidal framework from Western Armenia in a long time. But you're right that like by virtue of like we often mention that people didn't talk about the genocide after it happened. Like there was a lot, it took time before it was studied or before the history was like archived or spoken about. And there were some survivors who immediately started talking about it, like Aurora Martikanyan. But like for the most part, like there was a lot of silence, and I think that's also led to like the history that's remained, on top of like all of the other reasons that are true for history generally, to being so tied to the upper class. Like we know a lot about houses and insurance papers and life insurance policies and all of these things, but these day-to-day connections to the land, so much of that, I don't want to say it's been lost, but it's been minimized. And this wave of greenwashing from Azerbaijan, literally like planned by Israeli and Turkey, like Israeli companies supported by Turkey, has really made me revisit that like spiritual aspect of connection to land in a big way. Because I mean, I think like at our core, that is what we're connected to. At our core, that's what we're talking about. But for so many reasons, all informed by empire, Armenians have been placed into a different narrative, one of like national movements, one of self-determination, things like that. And I really I was looking at I was looking at a lot of like Palestinian advocacy, and I was impressed, and also just like really emotionally touched by how much the connection to land has been preserved like over many, many years, and how much that's remained. And I'm absolutely certain that so much of that is just like intrinsic to how much Palestinians love their land. But I also think some of that, I don't want to say that Armenians don't love their land, because it's not that. I think it has to do with how many empires have strategically tried to divorce Armenians from the connection to their land through like many different ways. But yeah, it's really fucked up to see like Azerbaijan talk about like creating net zero energy, or what, I forgot what the photo actually said, in an empty land devoid of people. Like, of course of course they don't have energy usage there right now. But on top of that, like you can't have ecologically clean policies without the indigenous people of these lands. It's not possible, because it's an oxymoron. If you remove the people, you've removed a portion of the ecosystem, an intrinsic portion of the ecosystem.
Kind of segueing, I think, from Anna's, reminding us of the connections with, Azerbaijani aggression and militarism. I wanted to talk a bit about the context of Azerbaijan winning the bid for COP28. So I was looking at how countries bid for it. And so applications get assessed for things like, the value of going to that country, whether the country is able to host it, like whether they have the facilities, or if they're able to provide the security to all these world leaders that are coming. And then regional group members hold consultations to determine which country from their region will make an offer to host COP. So in this case, what happened is, Azerbaijan made an offer, and Armenia blocked it. And Armenia bid as well to be the host of COP28. Then what happened is that Azerbaijan offered a prisoner exchange deal to Armenia. Azerbaijan offered to hand over 32 Armenian POWs in exchange for Armenia dropping its bid to COP28 and supporting Azerbaijan's candidacy. And Azerbaijan had been illegally holding over 50 at the time Armenian prisoners of war, most of whom were captured after the end of the 2020 war, contra to the 2020 peace agreement. So Armenia agreed. But what's interesting, and by interesting, I mean like below the fucking belt, is that Armenia was also to hand over 2 Azerbaijani POWs. That's not problematic in and of itself. It's that these were soldiers who wandered into Armenian territory in April of 2023. But one of them had murdered a 56-year-old Armenian man who was working as a security guard at a waste disposal facility. And he had just been sentenced to life imprisonment last week when this deal was made. So this was the cost.
Yeah, I think that basically the last 3 years have been the prisoners of war that Azerbaijan took in violation of international law. And also, speaking of connections, they didn't always even acknowledge that they were prisoners of war. They often kept them in this like international legal limbo. Some of them were tried and committed of crimes in kangaroo courts, which is similar to how the US treated its own prisoners of war in Guantanamo Bay. But it's underpinned basically any and all of Azerbaijan's like actions and ability to maneuver, because there's always these people hanging. And so for 32 people to be released, you can see how significant this greenwashing campaign is to Azerbaijan to release 32 people. Yeah.
So I wanted to segue a bit. As I think we'll start slowly closing out the conversation. We know, or at least we're still learning of how the current COP in the UAE, how it was perceived by UAE officials, and what they basically hoped they would get out of this. And what they hoped they would get out of this is a combination of what we would call greenwashing, making them look good, basically. And also, we later learned actual oil deals. They were actually hoping to get oil deals out of COP. This was leaked. There was a lot of controversy and noise, and supposedly they denied that this is what they were hoping to do. And actually, the actual statement, I have it here. Al-Jaber, the president of COP in the UAE, asserted that the UAE does not need the COP presidency to establish business deals. So basically saying, actually, we don't even need this. We can do this alone, which might be true. But it's interesting because I know obviously of, we can talk a bit about it anyway, but why it's problematic for authoritarian governments, actual literal monarchies, authoritarian monarchies for that matter, like the UAE, and in the case of Azerbaijan next year, petro-dictatorships, why it's problematic that they host COP at the same time. And I want to get into that. At the same time, I've been kind of more of the opinion of like, if they want this kind of international attention, let's make sure they regret it in one way or another. One thing that the UAE never has is protests. They're extremely rare. For one, most of the population in the UAE are not Emiratis and not deprived of the citizenship and are migrant laborers from largely Southeast Asia, India, and so on. And for two, the government doesn't allow them anyway. And so, but you had some protests, you had some statements from folks attending COP that in any other circumstance, and the same was true of Egypt last year, in any other circumstances would simply not be allowed. So last year in Egypt, we had statements of folks supporting the release of Ala, for example, and other prisoners, Egyptian prisoners in Egypt. This year, we had folks, including like main speakers of lots of pavilions, panels basically saying like, stop the genocide in Gaza. which for the UAE's official position is not good because they are now allies with Israel since they normalized after the Abraham Accords. And what I'm saying is not that this is ideal. It's not. Clearly, I don't want any of this to be the case. But more that if they're sort of actively seeking some attention, essentially, and what their goals, let's say, I'm assuming Azerbaijan's goal would be pretty similar to what the UAE wanted to get out of it, and maybe even more explicitly so because of the gas deals. That they want to greenwash, they want to make it look better, they want to make themselves look better. And all I'm saying is that it's also kind of a opportunity to make them regret this a tiny bit. It depends what will be allowed and not allowed at COP, because COP, there are certain guidelines that in theory, the governments hosting COP have to allow. And there's also the aspect, and I'll stop on that, of tenfis, which is what we call in Arabic, of basically letting air out. That's what that's what the term means. And the long story short, I did an entire episode on this in the context of Syria. I can link it in the show notes. But the reason I'm mentioning this is that sometimes governments want to let some democratic aspirations, they would allow some of it to express itself, manifest itself. Like, oh, do this small protest here, we'll allow a petition, whatnot. And the Arab world, that's often to do with Palestine. But sometimes it actually gets out of hands. They don't know how to entirely control once they say yes to the crowd, so to speak, whether the crowd will abide by the rules and regulations and that are imposed on them by the authorities. And COP is very special because you have all of these people from all over the world who don't give a shit about Aliyev personally and maybe don't even know who he is, are not familiar with that kind of pressure, you might say. And so I'm personally curious. I still think it's a bad idea that they got it, but now they did get it, and I'm hoping they regret it. Is what I'm saying.
I think here you have, and I was actually going to mention Egypt as well because it was such a good case study in terms of, what people were writing about it already, the problematicness of Egypt hosting COP27. You can cut that part out because I'm not sure, but I think I'm not sure about concrete sort of deals, oil and gas deals or whatever, but I think, because Azerbaijan isn't able to draw any internal legitimacy as a political, governing body, as a state, because it's not democratic, it attempts to kind of boost its image in this way through these kind of big ticket events, because, it also hosted Formula One a few years ago. So this is clearly something that, it likes doing. It likes, showing itself on this international stage as this kind of thing. And, for years it's been pouring money into Baku to kind of turn it into this B-side Dubai, making it kind of devoid of any local culture. But I think when I was reading, and Joey, maybe this is going to end up in a question to you, actually, when I was reading about the critiques of COP in Egypt, there were so many organizations that came out against it and kind of drawing attention to the political prisoners in Egypt. And, Greta Thunberg also denounced the event, being held in this place that violates basic human rights. Are people fooled? Is this something, I mean, I guess they are. I mean, this is why they're kind of pulling out all the stops to host it. But in my mind, I just think who looks at it's kind of the same with the Olympics when I see, countries kind of lining up to host it. It's kind of like, I don't know, everyone, I don't know, maybe it seems to me like patently problematic, but.
Yeah. Sorry, Anna, go for it. I need to silence my dog for a sec.
I mean, I wonder if it's hello, I'm Joey and I'm answering. I wonder if it's as simple as the more of these events that you hold, the more you are just a normal country doing stuff on the world stage, and these are your side issues, right? Yeah. Because that, in some ways, it's also Israel's goal, right? It's to be well, we're only as violent as everybody else. In fact, we're less violent than everyone else, but everybody's got problems. Everyone has issues. This is our issue. Let us deal with our issue. And I think Azerbaijan, has a similar goal to be everybody's got problems and we're solving our problems, but that doesn't mean that we can't host Formula One or strike energy deals with you or be a part of the like green energy movement. Azerbaijan is also a part of the non-aligned movement, which is like it arose in opposition to like the Cold War split between like Western and Eastern countries, etc. And
it doesn't mean anything anymore.
It doesn't mean anything anymore, but like it's still one of the only kind of like blocks, I guess, in the UN, and like it's weird to talk about it in a universe where it doesn't mean anything anymore. But like Armenia never joined it, and it's like it's odd because it's not odd. There's a reason they did that, because they're positioning themselves as like a lot of different things as part of the green movement, as a power on the world stage that's able to host like sporting events and like, you know, be a name and a player, while simultaneously like interacting with non-aligned countries that have like prior histories of colonization and want those addressed in international law and in the UN. So I think like they're doing everything at once. I will say, Joey, to your point about like protests in Azerbaijan, something like this is where the relative unknown that is like Armenian struggle becomes an issue, because I think like Palestine has a strength, which is that it has become like a cause of the global left in a lot of ways. And that's a good thing. That is like a righteous and true thing. Armenian struggle has not, for a lot of different reasons. I think one of them being that like the broader Christian movements in the world are evangelical and Protestant. This is my like armchair theory, but like they're evangelical and Protestant, so they really don't love orthodoxies to begin with, and so we're the wrong kind of Christian for the Christians. We're like, we can't really fit into a racial paradigm as understood in the West, because race works completely differently in the Middle East, and it works even more differently in former Soviet countries. And we don't really like, there isn't really a paradigm that we can fit into because of, you know, the way that colonization was defined by international law. We don't always fit into that either. And there's plenty of reasons for why like that come from Armenians themselves for why like Armenia has not come out as like, I think, a cause of the global left. But all this to say that Azerbaijan does not allow Armenian people into Azerbaijan. And I'm not saying Armenians, like Armenian nationals, I'm saying Armenian people, period. Like if you have an Armenian last name, you can't get into Azerbaijan. This is, as far as I understand it, like an unofficial state policy, but one that is very much enforced. Like there was a Russian guy who got on a plane, ended up in Baku, and had to turn around and go back because he was like, what the fuck? Because he had an Armenian last name. He was a Russian Armenian. But you know, they've shown willingness to loosen that policy for big events like I think they were hosting were they hosting the World Cup not the World Cup, they
were hosting something football,
a soccer thing. My dad's gonna kill me for not knowing what it is.
Mkhitaryan had to pull out because they basically told him that they couldn't guarantee his safety. Henrik Mkhitaryan, who used to play for Man U.
Yeah, so there was like some back and forth on it. Like an Armenian soccer player who is an Armenian citizen, he initially didn't want to go, and then they said they couldn't guarantee his safety. There was some back and forth. I think in the end they like basically like, yeah, of course we can guarantee your safety, but he ended up not being able to go. But that's what I mean, where like they will loosen their policy. They'll say, oh no, of course we'll let Armenians in, but one, their safety can't be guaranteed, and two, like they have a state policy of not allowing Armenians into the country. Like Armenians are in like real danger if they go there. So Armenians can't go there. Armenians don't have a lot of allies who are like stringent enough and who care about this enough, who are going to like raise hell at this conference. I would love it if Greta Thunberg were to like denounce Baku's hosting of this. That'd be great. She's on point about everything else. You might like, you know, Greta, hello. But that being said, like I think there's like an element of I think they gain more than they stand to lose, in part because they're a newer, like Azerbaijan's a newer name too. They're making a name for themselves, which means that their issues are also like are just barely starting to make a name for themselves. So I don't know. I like if you're going to COP, please protest. Like I think that'd be great. Like if you are someone who's there and you happen to be listening, organize yourself. But I don't know that that's a high possibility. And especially considering that like I'm waiting to see when it's officially announced and when this like image of their announcement of Karabakh being the first what do they call it, the first net zero. Yeah.
Zero emissions. By the way, that means, for people that don't know, that means it's absorbing more carbon dioxide than it's giving off.
Yes.
It's forests and mountains. Like, I don't,
without people. They're not even exhaling carbon dioxide. Like, what? But yeah,
it's even better than net zero than by that definition.
Yeah. I mean, it's like net negative or something, that makes no sense. But my point being simply that there's like Azerbaijan has set it up such that I think they're well positioned to have this work out better for them than to regret it. That doesn't mean that we can't stop that.
I think one thing we could kind of look out for, what happened in Egypt in the run up to COP being hosted there was a total clampdown, arrests, activists. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw that in Azerbaijan, but at the moment, I'm already seeing that happening in Azerbaijan, and with essentially practically no independent journalists left, I don't know what the landscape will look like in Azerbaijan in the run-up. If there's going to be anyone left to arrest, I don't know.
Yeah, this always gets me because I actually think like I think Armenian struggle is informative. I don't think it's like small and irrelevant. And I think that you can see by the connections between Azerbaijan and Israel and Turkey, and like you can see how informative and how much of a blueprint it is. You can see how it like fits into the cycle. But it's still relatively unknown. And I think Azerbaijan has exploited that very well. And this is like, there's almost like a perfect storm of Azerbaijan itself being a relative unknown, of their like dictatorship clamping down on any internal dissent. There being relatively little internal dissent to begin with. Like, let's not, like there isn't really. There are anti-Zionist Israelis. There are I don't know if there are none, but there are so few voices that talk about Azerbaijan's state building project as like fundamentally based on the erasure and genocide of Armenians. That like level has really not been reached in popular discourse, I think. Yeah. And when it is reached, it's like in secret, like, and you're getting these like, you'll get like anonymous statements. Anyone who ever said that out loud would be like jailed faster than I
or they're individuals, so they don't pose a threat as such. Yeah,
there's really no movement for that, is I think what I would say. So there's relatively little dissent within Azerbaijan. The dissent that exists, which is like brave and really scary and admirable, is clamped down instantly. And there's no international media attention. So if there's no independent journalists within Azerbaijan and no one's saying, hey, why the fuck aren't there independent journalists within Azerbaijan? You're getting this like sort of like silent storm where they can fill the narrative gap. And like the erasure of Armenians across the Middle East and like the erasure of our presence generally as like an important people, that if we disappear, there's something wrong. That I think also feeds into it because like, Armenians have interacted with so many different people throughout history. There are a lot of people who should notice if we disappear. Certainly in Lebanon, somebody would like turn around and be like, where'd everybody go? But I think like our contributions and our like importance has sort of been minimized across the Middle East broadly for sometimes even non-genocidal reasons, but like for, as like a lot of different forces are at play there, not only Turkey's genocide. And that I think also contributes to like, it's just a minimization of the issue. So you really don't see how much Azerbaijan is greenwashing its existence, which is dangerous for like, for the climate movement too, because like there's a danger that you're just going to overlook this country's like
actual record.
And not actual record, but like their future reliance on fossil fuels, the way that fossil fuels underpins this regime and this state. And fossil fuels and genocide. Azerbaijan.
I'll just say a quick thing. And technically, since Anna started this entire thing as like, I'll speak as Joey. So this was my answer as well. What you guys just heard, that was my voice.
Yes.
And now I will speak as Anna. We can do these things. It's funny. But I would argue that sports washing has been more effective as a tactic than but a lot of the other washings. Like probably, definitely better, more efficient than pink washing, for example, because there are many homophobic countries already that don't care if you're pink washing. Greenwashing as well, obviously, and sports washing and greenwashing tend to go hand in hand. But I think there is something to be said about these states have a intention by hosting, let's say, Bahrain hosting Formula One, or Qatar obviously hosted the Football World Cup last year, or whatever it may be. But there's a difference in attention between your Football World Cup, which is the biggest sporting event in the world, and a COP, which is the biggest UN climate whatever thing in the world, and versus a Olympics even, which isn't as big actually, or Formula One, or whatever. Just in terms of how much, and I'm not saying this is a good or bad thing. I wish it was more attention on the lesser known ones. Formula One, I was involved in writing a bunch of different reports on the sports washing in Bahrain, and to this day, the Formula One, like F1 as like the event, the company and whatnot, keep on denying that Bahrain does anything wrong, you know, and et cetera, et cetera. Like it's a worldwide problem, and whenever you have a sporting event, for example, you're gonna have the Olympics game in Paris soon. It's gonna be a nightmare for everyone living in Paris, and Parisians know this. But it has this different vibe almost, because what Qatar did, okay, in the World Cup, the Football World Cup, is that Qatar, one of its main arguments against too much criticism or whatnot is like, well, why can't we do it if France can do it, or if whatever can do it? And of course, in the moment, it's enough to give you pause, and a lot of people, unfortunately, did kind of jump on that bandwagon of defending Qatar during the World Cup. Because, yeah, I mean, of course, it's hypocritical for the Americans to complain, or for the French to complain, or for the whatever to complain. But then, because it's hypocritical, therefore, there isn't as much attention paid that should be paid. And so it ends up kind of, it levels out the playing field in some sense, but towards the lowest common denominator. And that's why, like, Israel hosting Eurovision was kind of the same thing. It's like, well, why can't we host it if, I don't know, fucking Australia can host it and they're not even in Europe? You know, whatever the arguments are, it can work in the moment as long as you present, as long as what pops up in front of the camera looks roughly the same. So if you look at the best hits of Eurovision, you may not know if this one is in Tel Aviv or this one is in Stockholm or whatever, because it's all part of Eurovision. And that, even the fact that this can happen, that you have like a video compilation on YouTube, is already a success of Eurovision in Tel Aviv, as in it served its purpose. So I think what happens is that there's almost like it's like a different scale maybe, and COP and the World Cup have those two. I'm sure there's a few others I'm not thinking of. COP is very particular, as I said, because they have to abide by certain basic regulations if they host the COP. Doesn't mean they won't break them, they probably will, but that means that you have some kind of leverage there that I think, if I'm not wrong in this analysis, a commonality with a lot of dictatorships like the Aliyev one is that for the most part, they're not always very good at planning ahead for these kinds of eventualities. They are too full of themselves. Doesn't mean that they won't plan at all, but it may be that there is some stuff can be done there that they themselves don't expect. So I'm not saying it's a good thing, and I'm not saying they won't probably get more out of it at the end than not. It's just that these are the cards we're kind of dealt, handed. And I'm wondering, in any case, thinking out loud, if anything can be done out of that. Yeah.
I will say that, like, this is my issue with like a state-centric world, period, because for regimes to maintain power, they have to do like awful things. And I'm not like, this isn't even to say that the awful things that Azerbaijan or Israel are doing aren't like uniquely terrible. But I almost think it's irrelevant. Like, I think hypocrisy should point us to an entitlement to violence more than it should delegitimize criticism. Like, if hypocrisy is the thing that's being pointed to say that, like, well, why shouldn't we do it? Then that means that regime is saying that they're entitled to violence. They are entitled, and look at who they're pointing to, and you'll see the level of violence that they feel entitled to. And I also think that, like, we're never going to, like, in a world where states are responsible for like the majority of, like, important events, be that social or political, we're gonna like deal with this problem. So yeah, I think we should use it to our advantage. And I also think that like what I want is that for this to be a reason for activists and just like people of conscience around the world to recognize the importance of various struggles. There was that little like tweet that was going around earlier, early into Israel's genocide in Gaza, and it said Palestine is freeing us. And I really, really do believe that. But I also think there are a lot of struggles that are going to be necessary to free us. And I want these conversations to point to them. Like I want people to see them and to learn from them and to participate in them. Because I don't think we're going to be in a world where a country hosting COP doesn't have an ulterior motive in hosting COP. It's not always going to be genocide. It's pretty unfortunate that it is genocide in this particular instance. But that being said, like that should point you in that direction and say, well, what can we now do now that we know a piece of their plan? What can we now do, and how can we learn from what they're doing to see it somewhere else? So yeah, I don't think there's nothing to do. I don't even think that it's that there will be no resistance at COP. I think that Azerbaijan has planned this well, but I also like I hope that people listen and are able to like see why this is important and yeah, learn from it.
Okay, so I guess what we can say, I mean, we will not find, I think, a satisfactory of just wrapping it up anyway, because we talked about, let's say, roughly a dozen different things, all linked, of course, that in the like by themselves can be worth like entire episodes and probably more than that. I will say that I said this before the Qatar World Cup, and I ended up not being able to do as much with that as I wanted. But what I mean by like there's an opportunity there, and Anna, you kind of you explained it very well as well, that like for the most part those states want to get something out of it, and they probably will get a lot of what they want out of it. And I'm sort of hoping that by being organized and thinking about it this way, we're able to enact some kind of cost to greenwashing. Greenwashing has very little cost and a lot of rewards. And I think that greenwashing should be significantly costlier to those corporations and well, the multinational corporations, the oil ones in this case, and of course the governments, the petro-dictatorships and others. So that I maybe we'll see based on our capacity and whatnot, we'll see if we are able to do something, some kind of focus on COP in Azerbaijan and see what comes out of it. But with that said, Anna, Karena, thank you a lot for doing this as usual, as always.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joey.